Hi, folks. Since I can't be in class today, I thought I would give you a little bit of an overview of what we've looked at so far to give it some perspective. I appreciate how you've been working through the new technology. I've had to repost some stuff. The key is that if you've read and understood the material, I want to just grade your participation, and eventually I'm going to have to grade your understanding and knowledge of the beginning of history. At the beginning of class, we asked the question, when did history begin? And I guess a lot depends on who you talk about, a lot of different answers. But traditionally, people who are historians look at history beginning with the first written records, and that's what we're going to be getting to in today's lesson. So I want to kind of give you an overview first. So from prehistory or prehistoric times to history. So a bit of an overview here. Let's see if this will go to the next one. Okay, so the question is, how old is time? We know that if we looked at all of human existence, Homo sapiens sapiens, most of our existence as a living species is prehistoric. So much of what we know from science has been controversial, and some is beyond the realm of science. So, like we talk about the traditionally Christians that understood creation was happening, well, about 6,000 years ago in the stories of the Bible. Scientists are going to take us to a different place, and that's what we'll be looking at here. Now, one way to conceptualize the depth of time is to consider this. If we make a timeline where 1 foot equals 20 years, so meaning that 12 inches is 20 years, it would take 101 feet to take you back to the beginning of the Common Era. 101 feet. So you imagine that that's about a third of a football field. It would take you 235 feet to get you back to the pyramids, which is a little bit less than a football field. This is again on a different scale than what I have in front of the board. 300 feet which is 6,000 years, takes us back to about the first written language. 300 feet, the length of a football field. And we know that 525 feet would take you to the first farmer. So you'd have to be off the football field to do that. But if you imagine that timeline, where do we get the first Homo sapiens sapiens, the first biological modern humans? About 500,000 years ago, 6,000 feet. Gives you a perspective of time. So if 1 foot equals 20 years, you'd have to go back 6 miles to get you back to the first use of fire by some of our pre-Homo sapien ancestors. And 26 miles would take us back to our first human ancestors. And to get back to the beginning of Earth, according to geologists, wouldn't be a matter of feet. It would be a matter of 43,561 miles, the beginning of the Earth. On this scale, you're only 9 inches. So a timeline of 9 inches covers you, and a timeline of 3 feet would cover me. So you take a look at this. Automobiles have been around for about 5.7 feet. So I'm probably about half as old as the automobile as this technology. And the whole history of the United States as an independent country would be 11, almost 12 feet. So some things to think about. We've been reading section 1 and 2. It's an enormous chronological band of history, meaning that it's hard to comprehend. 1 or 2 years we could deal with. Some of you guys have been around for 15 or 16 years, but to imagine a 500,000 years, it's very difficult. In the prehistoric era is before humans would develop written records. We're going to read about that today, ironically, right? And then we're going to look at the historic era from the time of written records. The division between prehistory and history occurred at different times in different places. Writing systems developed in many cases independently in different places on the earth. But the system of writing was so convenient when other people would come across it, they copied it for their own languages. And eventually, writing became one of the hallmarks for the spread of complex civilizations. Can you imagine our society without writing today? I mean, we're not carving into clay, but we are certainly looking on our iPads and using the same kind of technology in some ways that our early ancestors used almost 6,000 years ago. The period before the historic era has been divided into stone ages, 3 really. We didn't talk much about the Mesolithic. We'll focus on the Old and New Stone Age, the Paleolithic or the Old Stone Age, which is most of human history, where humans, like the rest of living things, were hunters and gatherers. In the Neolithic age, we start to see people using farming, and farming leads to permanent settlement. Maybe you pulled that out in your bell ringer. And we think that the change of developing farming was a response to the pressure of the environment, maybe an ice age. People had to eat. And when gathering became scarce, people began to see a connection between seeds and food, and eventually also by the animals they hunted to animals that they could domesticate. These human interactions you're going to read about created more complex communities. Farming, as you read last section, required a lot more complicated ways of organizing. It also led to the development of trade. Farmers produced by nature more than what they needed, and that trade created economic inequality. And a class of people who didn't produce anything, really, known as merchants, made lots of money moving surplus food and other objects to places where they were rare. And then, of course, whatever they would trade, they could again trade it again and take a little bit of profit. Complex governments and writing evolved to manage for the protection of wealth. And of course, when you had this wealth, you had a lot of people wanting to take it. So communities that developed this wealth would also have to develop things like military and taxes, religion to help manage information and to help keep people together. All these institutions that would grow in the beginnings of civilization, which became the hallmark of human culture and society in the civilized historic era. Civilizations that we're going to look at today tended to develop in river valleys. River valleys created dependable water and transportation. And generally speaking, these watered areas were in areas that surrounded it weren't so hospitable for farming. So it forced people to kind of gather in regions and work interdependently for farming. And this would lead to the development of the earliest states or nations that we might call them today. So as you guys read, I want you to think about this. We've already looked at the vastness of the Paleolithic age. When we're talking about, hundreds of thousands of years, we're talking about the space for human evolution. And we're also talking about the space of some very slow but important cultural evolution, like, for example, spoken language and religion and art. And eventually we're going to move further and faster when it comes to farming and villages and government, which is all things that are happening within the last 10 to 12,000 years. How did agriculture and civilization represent important human transitions? We've looked at that. Civilization is what we're going to focus on today. The tipping point where societies that were farming developed more complex organizations, which involved the development of governments, written language, expanding trade networks. So what were some of the defining characteristics of early civilizations, too? Because they set the pattern for societies that would follow. Okay, folks, let's see what we could do with that. As you guys read, follow the text and the assignments as they're posted there, and we'll finish those up on Monday.